You already know the title of the talk, Dear Feedback, you're Loopy, as everyone can see on the screens. Someone could shut these off. We're going to do without. I'm actually excited because I've been wanting to do an a cappella talk for ages. And I want to start with a confession. Like many people, I have a deep-seated fear of speaking in public. I've been told that it shows at the start of a talk and then it wears off, and we will just have to see. If you already know me from one of the 60 or something talks, not to humble brag, that I've been doing in various conferences in France and abroad for the past 22 years, that may seem odd, like an odd admission, because it's the first time I've ever mentioned it. What can I say? We live in times of fear, fear of COVID, fear of war, fear of looming climate catastrophe. What could I add? AI overloads. But here it is. I've been working on this talk for months, and for this whole time, a bit of me, a tiny part, fortunately, has been scared silly. Adding to the pressure is sharing a venue, if not a stage, with Ken Beck, whom I'll be speaking about. I think the only thing, I was going to joke that the only thing that would make it worse was if he was in this room, but you know he's not feeling well, so I really hope he gets better. But Jess is here, and that's kind of adding to the pressure as well. So thank you for increasing my stress level, which is what I want, because even though the topic of this talk is feedback, I wanted to start by discussing fear, in that the two have interesting connections. So what would fear, my fear, what would it say if it could talk? We're about to find out. Hello. My job is to protect you. Things are dangerous out there. Everyone knows what fear stands for. You don't? Fantasy experienced as reality. I use the power of your imagination to keep you out of trouble. Bad things might happen. I make you feel as if they were already here. I can't let you take risks. That's dangerous. You're still alive. So the way things are right now can be too terrible, can they? Don't you dare ask for help. If you ask for help, people realize that you're not perfect. If they realize that you're not perfect, they might turn away from you, not offer you a job, you will end up alone, and you will die. It's really better if you just muddle along as you've been. Don't you dare get out of bed and confront your neighbor at 2 in the morning when they're playing loud music. Yes, you're angry, but they're taller than you. You will get punched. You will die. What's the price of a good night's sleep compared to that anyway? Don't you dare bring up issues at work. Yes, there are things you're not okay with, but if you bring them up, you will have to defend and justify your position. You are going to have to call a meeting, and that will make people late. We'll get even more behind schedule than we already are, and people will resent you, will end up alone and die. Why not just smile and pretend things are great the way they are? Round of applause for my blue fellow here. Thank you. Fear can interfere with many things in life, and feedback is one of them. So that's the situation I want to dwell onto today, when fear interferes with feedback. And feedback has been an important topic in my life, in both my professional and my personal life for at least 20 years, since I became aware of extreme programming, thanks to Kent's book, Extreme Programming Explained. In the book, he introduced the 4 values, which later became 5, but we're going back 20 years, so it's the old school extreme programming. simplicity, communication, courage, and of course, feedback. So that's one connection. As you know, and to quote Kent again, courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is effective action in the face of fear. Kent actually related the 4 values in one paragraph. I'm going to quote because I think it's really a really nice self-contained system of values. Courage alone is dangerous. In context with the other values, it is powerful. The courage to speak truths, pleasant or unpleasant, fosters communication and trust. The courage to discard failing solutions and seek new ones encourages simplicity. The courage to seek real, concrete answers creates feedback. So for a number of years, working as a coach, I put Kent's words and ideas to good use. I observed that the topics I tended to avoid were typically those where the conversations I eventually had the most value. The most useful to me and the people I worked with. Those tended to be the scary topics. So I used my fear as a heuristic. I used fear as a gift, as a compass to where I would find value. Instead of running away from scary topics, I would run towards them. But I'm not going to lie, these past few years, things became more difficult. And I tried to understand why. And as usual, when I try to understand, I turn to a book. Reading Extreme Programming Explained had led me to discover, among other things, the work of Jerry Weinberg, who's sadly no longer with us. And I learned a lot from all of Jerry's books, this one being the exception. Not that I didn't learn from it, but it was not actually written by Jerry, but a couple of friends of his, the Seashores. This book is really chock full of gems about feedback. I cannot recommend it enough. I'm going to serve up a few of them, but I cannot cover the whole thing. One of those gems was that feedback becomes a lot more difficult when power is involved. And one thing to know about me is that for a long span of time, 15 years, I was a freelance consultant, so I did not have a boss, and I was not anyone's boss. And that changed a few years ago. I moved back to employee status to serve a noble cause, the digital transformation of the French public sector. And I had bosses again, and what's possibly worse, I gravitated towards the top of the hierarchy, towards higher management positions, and that implied that more and more I could be seen as being responsible for people, being a manager, being a boss. And it is this vertical relationship which makes feedback more difficult. It brings up questions of safety and questions of consent. So let's make this concrete. What kind of things does power say? Come here. Hi, Laurent. You know that team I asked you to work with? I think they're doing a really crappy job of dealing with our cybersecurity requirements. So I need you to put some pressure on them. Go tell them I told you that. Okay? Thank you. Another. Hi, Laurent. I had word from some of your colleagues, and they're stressing out about some of your decisions. Oh, no, I can tell you who. Or exactly what they said specifically. Just deal with it. And that's quite enough of this fellow, but if you want to give him a polite round of applause, that's fine with me. Don't like him much, hate to say. So that's an entire pattern, I think, of as triangulation, where somebody delivers somebody else's feedback to you. And one of the gems, one of the key insights in what did you say, is that feedback is always information about the person who gives it not about the person who receives it. Not information about you. It's information about the person coming to you. And so, feedback is necessarily an I sentence, a sentence in the first person. And given that feedback is that, if it's being delivered by a third party, there's an obvious problem. You cannot get clarification. You cannot say, I don't understand what you mean. Can you say more? You cannot get clarification. In other words, the very idea of one-way feedback, unilateral feedback, feedback that is a one-sided arrow, is a contradiction in terms. And that's such a key insight. You can see it right here on the book's cover, right? It's not this. It's not an arrow. It's a loop. And if you could take one thing away from this talk conceptually, it's the idea that we're better off using the term feedback loop rather than the bare word feedback. And we'll get into more details later. I hope that doesn't trigger your fear of theory. We'll be getting into some systems theory because we have a short time, not as deep as the systems workshop, obviously. There's another heuristic that a friend of mine reminded me of about feedback. If you give feedback to someone, are you 100% okay if they say, thank you, that was a gift, and now I'm going to go ahead and completely ignore your feedback? If you're not okay with that, maybe you can think of some times in your work or personal life, right, where you had this kind of situation. If you're not okay with the person ignoring the feedback, then it was not actually feedback that you had. It was more than that. It was a request. And if you have both of those characteristics where the delivery mechanism is one way and the intent is to get you to change something, then that is not feedback, that is manipulation. And that's scary. It's bad news. And what's been scaring me lately, what I've been taking as bad news is that management seems to like feedback again. It seems to be back in fashion, or in fashion, and I don't know, it's quite anecdotal, but I seem to be seeing lots of offers of trainings or classes on how to give effective feedback, how to create or install a culture of feedback in your company. Does that ring a bell for anyone? That should be good news, right? Because they are useful tools. In business terms, it was even good news for me. I had the good fortune of helping a friend, Wilfried from Le Bon Coin. His colleague is here. Hello. Improve the internal training on feedback given as part of the onboarding process. But what is bad news for me is, and this was good training, but what is bad news for me is seeing bad training. Training where they sell you on feedback is an indispensable management tool. I cringe. What is bad news is seeing articles that give new life to this old idea that to get someone to accept criticism, you will first have to give them, quote unquote, positive feedback, then you give them the bad news, and then you give them another round of, pat on the back, positive feedback, praise, what have you. You know what that's called? The shit sandwich, which I learned early on in agile circles. Yeah, you get the idea, right? A slice of something vaguely palatable, something absolutely inedible in the middle, and then the other slice at the bottom. Slice. That's wrong on so many levels, right? And it's even technically wrong, which is the worst kind of wrong, in using the term positive feedback, but I'll come back to that. While I'm here, allow me to rant for a little while about the feedback systems of conferences, not NewCrafts. That's true. I'm not just, I'm just not just shining shoes here. You know how there's always a feedback form or even a feedback app, and people would say, your feedback is important to us. Please remember to rate the speakers after each talk. Wait. Well, so first question. Do things really change as a result of you, conference attendees, giving feedback? Sometimes they do, right? Because a lot of the efforts in inclusion, for instance, I think came from taking feedback into account. But Rating the speakers. Who is this feedback intended for? The speaker, right? And what did we say about feedback? It's an I sentence delivered directly to the person. So what happens when you give me, for instance, a 1 to 5 star rating with or without a comment? All that does for me is send me back to school getting grades, right? So preemptively, and I know this is the right kind of conference and the right kind of crowd, the kind of feedback I would like to have from you that I value is you coming up to me after the talk and telling me, Laurent, that was boring. I can accept that. That was exciting. I can accept that. I disagreed with you on this or that point. I'm going to get some clarification from you. I agreed with you. That was great. You lost me at some point. Super useful feedback, that sort of thing. Another issue I have with training classes is that they focus on syntax to the exclusion and to the detriment of understanding and content. I'm a big fan of nonviolent communication, NVC, for instance. I'm a fan of other things, but that among them. An NVC has one thing which is easy to remember, which is the acronym. Does anyone know it? Other than NVC experts, obviously. Jess? You do? Shout it out.
Nonviolent communication?
Oh no, I mean the feedback formula. That's okay. ONFR, observations, needs, feelings, requests. But you have plenty of others. There's one, I'm not sure if it's in English or French, which is called OSCAR, that's nice and mnemonic. There's desk, description, express, specify consequences, something like that. And those can be useful tools. I'm not saying that they're not, but they're subject to exactly the same problem that we saw with Agile, where you had this, this initially useful user story format introduced by a friend of mine, Rachel Davies. As user X, I want feature Y so that I get benefit Z, right? And people love to make fun of that because it's easy to make fun of it, right? As the product owner, I want my login screen so that I can give you the velocity points. Yeah? As the customer, thank you. Always nice to have a great audience. As the customer, I want my features so that I can pay you per the contract. Something got lost in translation, right? So just using a syntax mechanically, a rote syntax, without understanding the intention and the theory behind it, results in imitation, but not incompetence. Worse, there may well be a hidden intent. Like, okay, we've sent everyone to feedback training. Now, hopefully, there will be no more whining when the time around comes for the annual performance review, right? That kind of thing. And we've seen this with Agile as well, which originally brought with it some hope of transforming relationships of power in the work that we do with our software. Quoting Kent again, extreme programming is about social change. But that intention was twisted and turned around until for many people today, Agile has come to mean a tool for oppression rather than a means to liberation. And if, I don't know, maybe it's too late, but if this talk can persuade you of one thing, I would like it to be that you refuse to let feedback go the same way. Additional problem, just as with Agile, which nowadays can mean anything and everything, there are just too many things, too many different things that we use the same word, feedback, to refer to. So, expert feedback, for instance. You go to someone who is an expert in the domain. I was getting help in making this talk. I went to Romeo, who's one of the, who's helping run the conference, who's got extensive experience. And my request was, I have this idea, but it's rough. Help me get into shape. I need your feedback on the idea and how I could get it closer to the end product. Then you have user feedback. You have something which is closer to the final product and you want to give or sell it to a given demographic and you want to see how they will receive it. You are going to seek feedback in that situation. There is performance feedback. You have a job to do for a boss, a client, and legitimately there's a question of, I am doing what you hired me to do. And then obviously there's the difficult topic of interpersonal feedback, where something is wrong or something is delightful perhaps, and you want to express that accurately. And these are fuzzy, not sharp categories. They are a spectrum, but I think it's in that last category, interpersonal feedback, that we tend to have difficulties. The real problem is not feedback, it's relationships. And that's the focus of nonviolent communication. So you've already met one of the two mascots of nonviolent communication, which is this fellow here, which I call Power. But actually in this talk, he's the jackal from NVC. The jackal stands for our tendency to judge, to blame, to be authoritarian, to tell, and so on. And we have the giraffe, who I recently learned was chosen in NVC to represent our capacity for caring, because it's the animal with the largest, it's the land animal with the largest heart. And also it has this tall neck, which allows it to rise above the plane and see a broader view of the situation. And the giraffe, who is my capacity to care, has a lot to say about feedback. What is your intention with this feedback? Who are you taking care of? Whose needs are you taking care of? Are you taking care of yourself? Are you taking care of the other person? Or are you taking care even of the relationship itself? As a simple, straightforward situation of feedback, you can just be taking care of yourself. You are wondering whether the green or the blue shirt goes better with that gray jacket you're wearing, and you don't know, so you ask someone else, what do you think? Hervé, what do you think? You don't care. So they're helping you see things from an outside perspective that you can have, that it's harder to have on yourself. Well, you can always stand in front of the mirror, but... And there are also simple, straightforward situations when you give feedback as a way of taking care of others. You see someone on the metro and their backpack is yawning open, and you say, hello, excuse me, I noticed that your backpack is open. Oh, thank you. It's a helpful, disinterested gesture. You're seeing them, and you're seeing something that the person doesn't see, and you're helping them see it. And that's the giraffe's job. My arm is going to tire, so that's... Please. It's not just that I'm going to get tired, but it's hard to maintain this stance of what they call the giraffe ears, the absence of judgment, the empathy. But yeah, so sometimes feedback can be that simple. It's about making the invisible visible. But things sometimes get more complicated. That's why I cannot keep the giraffe. Because, like for instance, somebody tells you, and they did not ask you, oh, that new haircut you have, it looks terrible. Okay. Or to pick a different example, and this is going to speak probably more to the French people, I don't know. This is surprisingly common in France. You are leaving work early at 5:30 p.m. and then suddenly one of your colleagues pipes up, oh, you're taking the afternoon off. Yeah, that happens. But you know the category of thing I mean, right? And what's going on for me with also kind of my judgy view of things is they are pretending to take care of you. They're actually taking care of themselves. There are situations, I mentioned consent, and consent plays a part in it. One of the questions in the book is, did you ask them? Right? Did you ask for feedback? And the other question they ask is, did you tell them? And so in some cases, there is some feedback that is useful to deliver directly without asking for consent. But in many situations, if they ask you about, if they tell you about the haircut or other kind of things without asking you first, it feels off. So the question is not really about consent. It's about, are we being clear on the intention on who we are taking care of? And one of the jokes I like in the book is we're taking care of our need, which is the need to give feedback. They joke that we can go without food for a month, we can go without water for days, but it seems that we cannot go longer than a few minutes or a few hours without giving into the need to give feedback. That's something to keep in mind. But anyway, that's, am I taking care of myself? Am I taking care of the other? Am I taking care of the relationship, this third entity? And one question is, well, do I even value this relationship? And as we've seen, one harmful fantasy about feedback is that it gets someone to change their behavior. That's fantasy. The reality is that what feedback almost always does is change the relationship in some way, hopefully to improve it. But sometimes a way to improve a relationship is to put an end to it. Like, okay, simple example, if someone is calling me on the phone to sell me double-glazed windows or professional training, giving them, I could be angry, but giving them that feedback doesn't serve any useful purpose. What I want to say is, stop calling me, right? Exit the relationship. There are relationships which just take too much space, too much energy, or which are toxic. And that's, I really don't want to go into that topic other than just one step in, other than to say, if a relationship is toxic or just doesn't work for you, then feedback is not the tool of choice. Getting out is the tool. But it's more complicated than that, because as you know, our relationships tend to be layered. What I call indexed. Like someone that I can see as a friend, let's call them Michel, is also a colleague. And so there's this overlapping between Michel friend and Michel colleague. And if I have some criticism to give to my colleague about the work, and we get our signals crossed, that can come across as a judgment on the friend relationship, right? So in some cases, we may have to get out of part of a relationship, or we may have to sacrifice one to save the other. But all that is still taking care of ourselves, basically. And in some cases, the more difficult choice comes about because you do value the relationship, or you do not have the choice to exit it. But there's something that bothers you. And another kind of trap that you can have in that situation is to deliver feedback on something which is not the thing, to waste energy on the wrong kind of feedback. To take an example from real life, I remember a conversation with someone who was my boss at the time, which started with the following: Laurent, I have some feedback for you. I have a problem, which is that you never accept the online agenda invitations. Well, okay, I come to the office and we can talk about them. So what's the problem? Oh, it's not really me that's bothered. It's a colleague of yours. Well, they could come and talk to me directly. Well, yes, but there seems to be communication problems between you two, and one thing led to another, and we had a conversation which was contentious and lasted 2 hours, and which was really uncomfortable. And I have my friend Romeo to thank for planting this paradox into my head, that many times we start focusing on problems too early, and then that degenerates into questioning the relationship itself. Whereas sometimes, if we start by focusing on the relationship, then maybe we have a chance to actually address the problems. And in a slightly weird or different way, anyway, what I would like now is to focus on relationships. Not me, actually. The time has come, said the walrus, to talk of many things, of systems and feedback loops and delays and collapses. We've had lots of talk on this stage of emotions, but how about taking things more analytically? At the risk of being too reductive, I would like to suggest seeing the relationship itself as a feedback loop. And a feedback loop is one of the basic building blocks in systems thinking and systems theory. It is the simplest thing that can exist and still deserve the name system. The oversimplified version of what systems thinking is about is, in fact, that what matters are not the things, but the relationships between things. Systems thinking is all about relationships. And that's the fellow who stands for my more intellectual side. So welcome to the desert of the real, not of the theoretical. Oh, and that's when I get to use this instead of, that's the one thing I haven't practiced. Oh, panic again, fear. Here you are, protect me. Okay, so systems and loops. Let's start by drawing a component, right? Just one alone. This could be a person. If it was a person, we would call them Dylan. Or it could be a characteristic of a person, say Dylan's stress or Dylan's motivation. It could also be something non-living, like a radiator, a heater, right? Oh yeah, of course. Thank you for your feedback. Can everyone see that? Seeking feedback with consent. It can be a heater. Do we have a system? No. Why? I'll make you do all of the work. Because it's inert. Nothing interesting is happening here. What do we need? Yeah, well, at least one more component. I would love to have a relationship here, but not yet, right? So we need to have at least a second component. And it could be a second person, so we'll call them Riley. And that could be whatever, Riley's stress. And it could be a non-living thing as well. It could be a thermometer. So do we now have a system? Because we don't have an interaction to start with. So we bring them into the same room. And Dylan can talk to Riley, and the thermometer can respond to the rise in temperature from the heater. Does that sound right? That's where I have lots of pressure on me, but it's okay if it's a simplified version. It's even okay if it's wrong in some ways, because I know that there are lots of people who will bring me feedback. Do we have a system? That's more debatable, but my view of things is that we still don't have a system because the interaction is going to have only linear effects. Dylan is going to talk Riley's ears off. Nothing more is going to happen. We start to have something interesting when we introduce a second interaction. And so, for the moment, forget about people and imagine that we now have a heater and a thermometer, which is going to be more of a thermostat, but anyway. And what happens is when the temperature reaches a certain threshold, the thermometer here turns off the heater. Okay? But I've written off here, that only represents 1/2 of what's going on, because if the heater is now off and the temperature goes back down again, then at some point something in the thermostat is going to kick in again and is going to stop inhibiting the heater or turn it back on or whatever. And so the way we represent that is by having a minus sign here. So there are variants on this notation, which, thank you, Jess. You reminded me of the official name. It's causal loop diagrams. And this is, I had even forgotten the name, a balancing loop. But I think of it as a self-regulating system, and I think of it as the simplest system you can have. Okay, let's try again with people, and let's try to see a feedback loop where the overall sign is positive. So, Dylan is a bit judgy, and they tend to blame Riley. And when Riley perceives blame, they lose motivation and don't do as good as a job as they would usually do. And when Riley's work quality degrades, Dylan becomes more blaming, which leads Riley's work quality to decrease again, and so on. Right? So the two actions go in the same direction, and you have a reinforcing loop. And is that a system? Trick question, maybe. Who thinks it is a system? And I would say it's not really one, or it's not a stable system. It's not a system that will stay around as is for very long. Riley is going to go into depression, or Dylan is going to fire Riley. And then you will no longer be able to observe that interaction. So it's kind of a theorem for me that if you have a reinforcing loop in a system, and the system is still around or has been around, there has to be a balancing loop also somewhere in the system. And that's already a testimony to the usefulness of this as theory, that you can make deductions, right? It's not just throwing bubbles and arrows. We can keep the exact same system and change the labels, and the situation is going to be different. Like, Dylan starts out as supportive of Riley, and when Riley feels support, they do a better job. And when Riley does a good job, Dylan, who is a bit basic as a manager, becomes even more supportive, right? It's still the exact same system. We haven't changed anything in structure. We've only changed the labels and the initial dynamic. Which is why I think it's important to use the terms positive feedback or negative feedback in that technical sense. Is the overall sign positive or negative, and not impose any value judgment related to the current state of the situation, right? That's why positive feedback is wrong. I discovered this notation, in fact, the whole field of systems analysis and theory, thanks to, guess who? Kent, who was the first systems thinker I became aware of, and who got me interested in Jerry Weinberg, who wrote a lot about this notation. Early on, extreme programming was described as an interlocking system of feedback loops. And what I find fascinating is, again, a very small amount of notation is surprisingly appropriate to reflect and to think about many real-life systems and the problems that come with them. I've only shown you the very bare basics, but you can compose these kind of things, and so you can describe complex systems out of the basic building block, which is interactions between simple components and loops. And it applies to technical systems, to the world of effectors and sensors and that kind of thing, but it can also apply equally well to human systems and to the complexity of human relationships. How am I doing on time? Oh, well, skip that. Christophe, who is somewhere in the room, and I had a workshop called the Fridge Game, or not in the room, I don't know, a workshop that we created to explore the dynamics of systems, and which was essentially about trying to control this extremely, so I'm going to have to spoil it for you, this extremely simple thing, which is a balancing loop. We only added one tiny wrinkle. Two, actually, but there's only one that's important. The The important wrinkle is this, which means a delay. The unimportant one is that we added something where we added a control so that people could play at setting the temperature on their thermostat. What really matters is the delay. Adding delay in a feedback system makes the system much harder to control. We found inspiration for that in a great book by Dietrich Dorner called The Logic of Failure. And what we found, what we replicated, because Dorner had done this experiment many times and we had become curious, we wanted to replicate it, was that people would have a really hard time. They would struggle. They would fall into magical thinking. I remember when one participant said, there must be something special about odd numbers. And remember, we were talking about feedback and fear. And so what happens when power complicates things is that when power leads to fear, is that we tend to keep feedback to ourselves longer. And my painful experience has been that in relationships where these kind of feelings, the blame and resentment and so on, pile up, and faster, they become worse and worse, and they blow up. But the problem is, where power is involved and you may not be able to exit, you have this kind of double bind. You must get that feedback out there, but you cannot. And there's a new danger that happens in that situation, which is that going back to a reinforcing loop, that reinforcing loop is usually between you and the person, right?